In the narrow corridors of the USS Beacon, a weathered woman in coveralls was about to refuse a direct order from a Navy officer. What started as routine maintenance work took a shocking turn when they came face to face with a disciplinary hearing that would expose everything. Cassandra Morgan wasn't your typical civilian contractor. For 25 years, she had spent her life commanding naval operations across the Pacific Fleet, known for strategic brilliance under impossible pressure. When she encountered Ensign Lee demanding unsafe equipment placement, she had no idea she was walking into a confrontation that would shatter her carefully constructed anonymity. Morgan cited safety regulations with surgical precision that would lead to questions no janitor should be able to answer. What began as a simple refusal to violate protocol would become a revelation that stunned an entire naval base. The Pacific Fleet would never be the same after discovering that their most decorated rear admiral had been scrubbing their decks for 8 months, invisible, forgotten, and systematically undervalued by the very institution she had sacrificed everything to protect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The USS Beacon groaned against its moorings as the pre-dawn fog rolled in from Monterey Bay, wrapping the Pacific Fleet's supply vessel in a blanket of gray silence. At 0500 hours, when most of the base was still dreaming of shore leave and home-cooked meals, Cass Morgan was already moving through the ship's narrow corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her cart squeaked softly as she maneuvered it past sleeping quarters and through the maze of passageways that formed the vessel's steel arteries. Mop, bucket, industrial cleaner, and a collection of rags that had seen better decades. These were her tools now, as familiar in her weathered hands as a compass and charts had once been. At 53, Kaz had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. Sharp cheekbones softened by time, gray eyes that seemed to catalog everything while revealing nothing, and prematurely silver hair pulled back in a regulation bun that spoke more of habit than requirement. She wore the same thing every day, navy blue coveralls with C. Morgan stitched above the breast pocket, steel-toed work boots that had walked more decks than most sailors would see in a career, and an expression of patient neutrality that had served her well in both her previous life and this one. To the officers who occasionally noticed her, she was just another civilian contractor, probably ex-Navy herself, picking up maintenance work because retirement wasn't paying the bills. The truth was both simpler and infinitely more complex. "Morning, Ms. Morgan." Petty Officer Second Class Malik Thompson's voice echoed softly in the corridor as he emerged from the engineering spaces, grease-stained coveralls and a coffee cup that had seen better days, marking him as someone who worked with his hands. At 28, Malik had the eager competence of a sailor who'd found his calling in the mechanical heart of naval operations, but also carried himself with the careful respect that came from understanding rank and hierarchy. "Morning, Malik." Kaz's voice was quiet, controlled, with just enough warmth to acknowledge their friendship without overstepping the invisible boundaries that kept her world safely small. She'd been watching him for 6 months now, noting his natural leadership instincts and the way younger sailors gravitated toward his steady presence. He reminded her of someone she had once known, someone who died following her orders in waters that didn't exist on any official charts. Malik gestured toward the forward compartment where he'd been working. "Got that bearing housing sorted, but the temp gauge is reading hot. Might want to take a look when you're in there. I mean, if you don't mind. I know you're just supposed to be cleaning, but you always seem to know when something's not right." It was true, though Kaz never explained how or why. She'd spent too many years reading the subtle signs of mechanical stress, understanding how ships spoke to those who knew how to listen. A slight vibration that meant worn bearings, a particular pitch in the ventilation that suggested filter problems, the way condensation formed in patterns that revealed air circulation issues. These things were as obvious to her as storm clouds to a meteorologist. "I'll check it," she said simply, already mentally cataloging the tools she'd need and the probable causes of an overheating temperature sensor. 20 minutes later, she was elbow deep in the forward maintenance space, having identified the problem, a loose connection that would have caused the gauge to fail completely within a week, potentially leading to catastrophic engine damage if the real temperature spike went unnoticed. She tightened the connection with practiced efficiency, cleaned the contact points, and ran a quick diagnostic that would have impressed the ship's engineering officer if he'd been paying attention.
"Miss Morgan," Chief Petty Officer Darla Knox's voice cut through the mechanical hum like a blade through silk. At 42, Knox was built like a battleship, broad-shouldered, steel-spined, and armed with the kind of authority that came from 24 years of Navy life and an absolute conviction that discipline was the difference between floating and sinking. Her khaki uniform was pressed to razor sharpness, her black hair pulled back in a bun that could have been regulation carved from granite, and her brown eyes held the calculating gaze of someone who learned to spot trouble before it spotted her. "Mr. Morgan." "Chief Knox." Cass straightened, wiping her hands on a rag and stepping clear of the machinery with the automatic deference that civilian contractors were expected to show. "Pre-deployment inspection is moved up to 0800. That means everything in this compartment needs to be spotless in 2 hours, not the 3 you are planning on." Knox's voice carried the particular edge that senior NCOs used when they suspected they were being questioned, even when no one had said a word. "And I mean spotless, white glove, Admiral's inspection, career ending if it's wrong, spotless." "Understood, Chief. It'll be ready." Cass's tone remained level, professional, giving nothing away. She'd learned long ago that the best response to unnecessary pressure was competent compliance, especially when you were wearing coveralls instead of shoulder boards. Knox's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she had detected something in Cass's response that didn't quite fit the profile of a civilian maintenance worker. There was something about the way the older woman stood, too street, too controlled, with the kind of bearing that usually came with years of command responsibility. But that was impossible. The personnel file clearly showed Cassandra Morgan as a retired petty officer discharged after 20 years and now working civilian contracts to supplement her pension. "See that it is," Knox said, then turned on her heel and strode away with the kind of purposeful movement that left no doubt about who was in charge. Cass watched her go, recognizing the type. A competent leader who learned to lead through strength and intimidation, probably because the Navy had taught her that authority was something you seized rather than earned. In another life, Cass might have taken Knox under her wing, shown her that real leadership was about trust rather than fear. In this life, she simply returned to her mop and bucket. The morning progressed with the familiar rhythm of shipboard maintenance. Sailors moved through their routines with the practiced efficiency of a crew preparing for deployment, while Cass worked around them like water flowing around stones, present but unobtrusive, necessary but unremarked. She cleaned around equipment installations, mopped passages that would be dirty again within hours, and quietly fixed small problems that would have become larger ones if left unattended. It was during the pre-inspection scramble that Ensign Jordan Lee made his appearance. At 24, Lee carried himself with the particular combination of confidence and insecurity that marked newly commissioned officers who hadn't yet learned the difference between rank and respect. His uniform was perfect, pressed, polished, and worn with the self-consciousness of someone still getting used to the weight of responsibility it represented. His brown hair was regulation short. His clean-shaven face showed the kind of earnestness that came from genuinely wanting to do well, and his green eyes held the slight wildness of someone who suspected he was in over his head but was determined not to show it. He'd been aboard the Beacon for 3 months, long enough to learn the ship's layout, but not long enough to understand its rhythm. Command had given him responsibility for the pre-deployment equipment inventory, a task that seemed straightforward until he discovered that naval logistics operated according to laws of physics that hadn't been covered at the academy. "You there," his voice cracked slightly as he addressed Cass, who was methodically cleaning around a bank of electrical panels. She could read the signs, someone facing their first real test of leadership and discovering that theoretical knowledge didn't always translate to practical results. "It will be completed within the time frame, Ensign," she said quietly. "Within the time frame isn't good enough." Lee's voice rose, drawing attention from sailors working nearby. The Admiral's inspection team arrives in 90 minutes, and I need this entire section perfect. Not almost perfect, not good enough, perfect. Malik appeared from around a corner, having heard the commotion. His expression showed the careful neutrality of an enlisted man watching an officer make a mistake, but knowing that pointing it out would only make things worse. "Sir," Malik said carefully, "Miss Morgan's been doing this job for 8 months. She knows the timing." "I don't care how long she's been doing it," Lee snapped, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the pressure. "I care about results, and standing around talking isn't getting us results."
Kaz said nothing, simply returned to her work. She'd seen this type of breakdown before. Young officers who'd been taught that leadership meant never showing uncertainty, never admitting mistakes, and never accepting anything less than perfection from subordinates. The Navy had been trying to teach them better leadership principles for decades, but old habits died hard, especially when careers were built on the appearance of infallibility. Lee watched her for a moment, clearly expecting some kind of response, an apology, a promise to work faster, some acknowledgement of his authority. When none came, his frustration deepened into something darker. "Are you even listening to me?" he demanded. Kaz straightened slowly, meeting his eyes with the kind of calm directness that had once made admirals think twice about their positions. "Yes, sir, I'm listening." Something in her tone, too measured, too controlled, carrying undertones of authority that didn't belong in a civilian contractor's voice, made Lee pause. For a moment, he seemed to see her differently, noting the straight spine and level gaze that spoke of experience far beyond her current role. Then the moment passed, and his embarrassment at being challenged by someone he considered beneath his notice hardened into anger. "Then move with some urgency," he said coldly. "Some of us have careers to think about." The morning inspection went smoothly, as Kaz had known it would. Admiral Mitchell's team moved through the ship with the kind of thoroughness that separated professional military evaluation from mere ceremony, checking everything from fire suppression systems to food storage protocols. They found nothing worth noting, which was exactly what Chief Knox had been hoping for and exactly what Kaz had delivered. By 1100 hours, the ship had returned to the organized chaos of pre-deployment preparation. Equipment needed to be moved, supplies had to be secured, and 1,000 small tasks required completion before the Beacon could leave port. It was during this period of controlled frenzy that the incident occurred. Lee had been assigned to oversee the relocation of communications equipment from a temporary storage area to the ship's permanent installation sites. The equipment was sensitive. Encrypted radios, satellite uplinks, and computer systems that represented millions of dollars in technology and capabilities that enemies would kill to compromise. Moving it required careful coordination, proper handling procedures, and strict adherence to security protocols. What it didn't require was speed for its own sake. "I need these boxes moved to compartment C7 immediately," Lee announced to the working party he'd assembled, which included Malik, 2 junior sailors, and Kaz, who'd been assigned to clean the storage area once it was emptied. Malik looked at the destination written on Lee's clipboard and frowned slightly. "Sir, compartment C7 is right above the fuel storage tanks. Regulations say communication equipment should be kept at least 50 feet from high-volatility fuel storage areas." "The regulations say a lot of things," Lee replied impatiently. "What they don't say is that we have time to debate every minor detail. The equipment needs to be secured before we sail, and C7 is the only space available." "It's not a minor detail, sir," Malik said carefully. "Fuel vapors can interfere with electronic equipment, and if there's ever a fire—" "There isn't going to be a fire," Lee cut him off, "and I don't have time for worst-case scenarios. I have orders to get this equipment installed and tested before we leave port." Kaz, who had been quietly listening while preparing her cleaning supplies, straightened slightly. She'd spent years dealing with the intersection of safety regulations and operational necessity, and she recognized the signs of a decision being made for the wrong reasons. "Ensign Lee?" Kaz turned toward her with visible irritation. "What?" "Petty Officer Thompson is correct about the fuel storage regulations. Moving communications equipment to C7 would violate NAVSEA Technical Publication 9074 AS-GIB 100, Section 4.3.2. The specific citation caused everyone present to pause. Most sailors knew the basic safety regulations, but the technical publications were dense, constantly updated documents that required dedicated study to master. For a civilian contractor to quote them chapter and verse was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Lee's face flushed slightly. "I don't need a civilian telling me how to do my job." "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Kaz replied evenly. "I'm telling you that moving sensitive electronics directly above fuel storage violates safety regulations that exist for good reasons." "The decision has been made," Lee said, his voice rising slightly. "The equipment goes to C7. That's an order." Kaz looked at him for a long moment, then at the boxes of equipment, then back at Lee. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but absolutely firm. "No, sir." The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Sailors stopped what they were doing. Malik's eyes widened. Even the ambient sounds of ship's operations seemed to pause in recognition that something significant had just happened. "What did you say?" Lee's voice was barely controlled. "I said no, sir. I won't participate in moving equipment to a location that violates safety regulations." Kaz's tone remained calm, professional, but unyielding. "If there's an alternate storage location that meets regulatory requirements, I'll be happy to help with the move." Lee's face went through several shades of red before settling on a color that suggested either apoplexy or stroke. "Are you refusing a direct order?" "I'm declining to participate in a safety violation," Kaz corrected. "The Whistleblower Protection Act and Navy Regulation 5370.2 both protect personnel who refuse to participate in activities that violate safety standards." The fact that she could cite regulations with that level of precision was becoming impossible to ignore. Malik was staring at her with expression that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time. Even the junior sailors had stopped pretending not to listen. "Those regulations apply to military personnel," Lee said, grasping for authority. "You're a civilian contractor." "Actually, sir, they apply to all personnel working aboard naval vessels, regardless of employment status. That was clarified in the 2018 revision." Cass's voice remained level, but there was something underneath it, a kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly where she stood and exactly what she was talking about. Lee stared at her for a long moment, clearly struggling with the realization that he was being outmaneuvered by someone he'd categorized as irrelevant. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with controlled fury. "Fine, but you can explain your insubordination to Chief Knox, and then you can explain it to whoever decides whether your contract gets renewed." He turned and stalked away, leaving the working party standing in uncomfortable silence. Malik was the first to speak. "Miss Morgan, are you sure about this? I mean, you're right about the regulations, but—" "But nothing," Cass said quietly. "Safety regulations exist because people died learning why they were necessary. I won't be part of ignoring them, regardless of the consequences." She returned to her cleaning supplies, but Malik noticed that her hands were perfectly steady and her expression showed no sign of concern about the confrontation that was clearly coming. 20 minutes later, Chief Knox appeared with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Morgan," her voice carried the particular edge that senior NCOs used when they were operating under pressure from above. "My office, now." Cass set down her mop and followed Knox through the ship's passages to the small compartment that served as the senior enlisted advisor's workspace. The office was a study in military efficiency. Every paper in its place, every regulation manual properly shelved, every surface clean enough to perform surgery on. Knox closed the door and turned to face her. "Ensign Lee says you refused a direct order." "I declined to participate in a safety violation," Cass replied, using the same words she'd used earlier. "That's not how he tells it." Knox's voice was flat, professional, giving nothing away.
He says you were insubordinate and cited regulations to justify defying legitimate authority. The regulations I cited are current and applicable. Moving communications equipment directly above fuel storage areas violates multiple safety standards. Knox studied her for a long moment, clearly noting the precision of her language and the confidence with which she spoke. You seem to know a lot about naval regulations for a civilian contractor. I read the manuals, she said simply. Most people don't memorize section numbers. Most people don't work on ships where mistakes can kill people. There was something in the way she said it, a weight that suggested she'd seen what happened when safety regulations were ignored, when shortcuts were taken in the name of efficiency or convenience. Knox, who'd spent 24 years in the Navy, recognized the tone of someone who'd learned lessons the hard way. But regardless of her personal opinions about safety regulations, Knox had a more immediate problem. A junior officer had filed a complaint about a civilian contractor, and the chain of command expected that complaint to be resolved quickly and definitively. The Navy ran on the principle that orders were followed, questions were asked through proper channels, and civilians who worked on Navy property understood their place in the hierarchy. "Here's the situation, Morgan," Knox said finally. "Ensign Lee is filing a formal complaint about your conduct. That means you're going to face a disciplinary board. And that means your contract status is going to be reviewed." Cass nodded once, as if she'd been expecting exactly this outcome. "I understand, Chief." "Do you?" Knox's voice carried a note of frustration. "Because from where I sit, you just threw away a steady job over a storage location dispute. Was it really worth it?" For the first time since the conversation began, Cass's expression shifted slightly, not toward worry or regret, but toward something that might have been sadness. "Yes, Chief, it was worth it." Master-at-Arms Samuel Ortiz found Cass Morgan exactly where the duty roster said she'd be, in the forward maintenance compartment, methodically cleaning around the machinery that kept the USS Beacon operational. At 31, Ortiz had the kind of presence that came from 8 years of military police work, broad shoulders that filled out his security uniform, and dark eyes that missed very little of what happened aboard ship. He'd been expecting to find a civilian contractor who was either defiant about the complaint filed against her or worried about the consequences. Instead, he found a woman who looked up from her work with the kind of calm attention that suggested she'd been expecting him. "Miss Morgan, I'm Master-at-Arms Ortiz. I need to escort you to the administrative offices." Cass straightened, noting the professional courtesy in his tone and the way he'd positioned himself, close enough to establish authority, far enough away to show respect. He was treating her like someone who deserved dignity, which is more than she'd gotten from some of the officers lately.
"Of course, Petty Officer Ortiz." She set down her cleaning supplies and pulled off her work gloves with movements that were economical and practiced. "Should I bring anything?" "No, ma'am. This is just an initial hearing. You'll have opportunities to present any documentation later if needed." As they walked through the ship's passages, Ortiz found himself studying his charge with professional interest. Most civilians who found themselves facing disciplinary action showed signs of stress, elevated breathing, nervous gestures, excessive talking, or defensive posturing. Morgan displayed none of these behaviors. She walked with a straight spine and measured pace, keeping proper distance without being told, and seemed more focused on observing her surroundings than worrying about her situation. "First time going through something like this?" he asked, more out of curiosity than procedure. "No," Cass replied simply. Something in her tone made him glance at her more closely. There was a quality to her voice, too controlled, carrying undertones that suggested experience with formal proceedings and official scrutiny. He'd heard similar tones from senior NCOs and officers who'd been through courts-martial or administrative reviews. They emerged from the ship onto the pier, where the morning sun was burning off the last of the coastal fog. The base bustled with typical pre-deployment activity. Supply trucks moved between warehouses and docked vessels. Formation runs echoed from the training areas, and the loudspeaker system provided a constant background of announcements and schedule changes. Cass walked through it all with the kind of familiarity that came from years of naval base life, automatically adjusting her path to avoid interfering with official formations and keeping to the right side of walkways without being directed. Ortiz noticed that several sailors they passed offered casual nods or quiet greetings, unusual for interactions with civilian contractors, who were typically acknowledged politely but not treated as familiar figures. "Have you been working here long?" he asked. 8 months. Before that, Cass was quiet for several steps. Other places. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The administrative building squatted like a concrete bunker between the piers and the main base, its government-issue architecture softened slightly by attempts at landscaping that had made peace with the salt air and coastal winds. The morning air carried familiar scents: diesel fuel from the truck routes, salt from the bay, coffee from the various administrative offices, and that particular smell of institutional facilities that seemed universal to military installations. As they approached the entrance, Ortiz found himself reconsidering his initial assessment of the woman walking beside him. Her posture was too good for someone who'd spent a career in civilian jobs. Her familiarity with base protocols, too ingrained to be recently learned. And her calm in the face of disciplinary action, too practiced to be natural. "Can I ask you something, Ms. Morgan?" "Of course." "What did you do before you started working maintenance contracts?" Cass looked at him with eyes that seemed to calculate exactly how much truth the situation required. "I served." "Navy?" "Yes." "How long?" Another pause, longer this time. "Long enough." They entered the building through doors that opened with the particular pneumatic hiss of government facilities, stepping into a lobby that smelled of floor wax and industrial disinfectant. The fluorescent lighting cast everything in that institutional greenish glow that made healthy people look tired and tired people look sick. Behind the information desk, a petty officer second class was fielding phone calls while simultaneously processing a stack of forms that seemed to regenerate itself every time he made progress. He looked up as Ortiz and Cass approached, his expression already shifting into the professional indifference that came from dealing with an endless parade of administrative problems. "Disciplinary hearing for Morgan," Ortiz announced. "Conference room C, second floor. They're waiting for you." As they climbed the stairs, Cass noted the familiar sounds of military administration, muffled conversations behind closed doors, the rapid-fire clicking of keyboards, and the occasional bark of laughter from someone who'd found humor in the day's bureaucratic challenges. It was a world she'd once navigated from a very different perspective, when her presence in these buildings meant that important decisions were being made, rather than that she was the subject of minor disciplinary action. "Nervous?" Ortiz asked as they reached the second floor. "No." He studied her profile as they walked down the corridor. "Should you be?" Cass considered the question seriously. "Probably." Conference Room C was a small, windowless space dominated by a regulation conference table and chairs that had seen better decades. The walls displayed the usual collection of official photographs, regulatory notices, and motivational posters that decorated military administrative spaces throughout the fleet. Chief Knox sat at one end of the table with Ensign Lee beside her, both wearing expressions of professional seriousness that suggested they were taking the proceedings appropriately seriously. Lieutenant Commander Fiona Zhao occupied the head of the table, her JAG officer insignia marking her as legal counsel for the hearing. At 35, Zhao had the sharp-eyed intensity of someone who'd made a career of analyzing complex situations and finding the truth buried underneath layers of regulation and procedure. But it was the man standing near the back wall who drew Cass's immediate attention. Admiral Henry Vargas wore the kind of casual authority that came from 30 years of naval service and enough decorations to suggest he'd earned his rank through competence rather than politics. At 58, he had silver hair, weathered features that spoke of years at sea, and dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his surroundings with automatic precision. He was supposed to be conducting a routine inspection tour of Pacific Fleet facilities, but something about the disciplinary hearing had caught his interest. Perhaps it was the unusual nature of a civilian contractor citing safety regulations to refuse orders, or maybe it was simple curiosity about how lower-level command decisions were made. Whatever had brought him there, his presence changed the dynamics of the room significantly. "Ms. Morgan." Lieutenant Commander Zhao's voice was crisp, professional, designed to establish the formal nature of the proceedings. "Please be seated. This is an administrative hearing regarding a complaint filed by Ensign Lee concerning your conduct during equipment relocation duties." Cass took the indicated chair, her movements controlled and economical. Ortiz positioned himself near the door, officially present as security, but actually fascinated by the unfolding drama. "Before we begin," Zhao continued, "I want to make it clear that this is not a criminal proceeding. This is an administrative review of your employment status and conduct while working under civilian contract aboard naval vessels." Admiral Vargas, who had been quietly observing the setup, found himself studying the woman at the center of the proceedings with growing interest. There was something about her bearing, the way she sat perfectly upright without appearing rigid, the way her eyes remained focused and alert without seeming defensive, that didn't match the profile of a civilian maintenance worker. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured. "I understand, Commander." It was a small thing, but Vargas noticed that she'd used Zhao's rank rather than her name, and that she'd done so with the kind of automatic precision that came from years of military protocol. Interesting. "Ensign Lee," Zhao said, turning to the young officer, "please state your complaint for the record." Lee straightened in his chair, clearly conscious of the Admiral's presence and determined to present his case professionally. "At approximately 11:30 hours yesterday, I was overseeing the relocation of sensitive communications equipment as part of our pre-deployment preparation. The equipment needed to be moved from temporary storage to its permanent installation site before we could complete system testing. Did you consider the regulations she cited?" Lee's face flushed slightly. "I considered them irrelevant to the operational necessity of completing the equipment move within the required time frame." Admiral Vargas, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward slightly. His movement was subtle, but it drew every eye in the room. "Ms. Morgan," he said quietly, "what regulations did you cite?" Cass looked directly at him, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition that neither quite understood yet, but both felt keenly. "NAVC Technical Publication 9074 AS-GIB-010, Section 4.3.2, regarding the separation of electronic equipment from high-volatility storage areas, sir." Vargas nodded slowly. "And you felt that regulation took precedence over the ensign's operational requirements?" "Yes, sir. Safety regulations exist because people have died learning why they're necessary. Operational efficiency should never override safety requirements unless lives are at immediate risk." The words hung in the air, carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple disciplinary hearing they were supposed to be conducting. There was something in the way she'd spoken, not with the defensive urgency of someone trying to justify their actions, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd made similar decisions before and understood their implications. Admiral Vargas found himself studying her hands, noting calluses that seemed inconsistent with janitorial work and small scars that suggested familiarity with more complex machinery than mops and buckets. When she'd spoken about safety regulations and operational necessity, Her language carried the precision of someone who dealt with both concepts at levels far above civilian maintenance work. Have you had experience with situations where safety and operational requirements conflicted? He asked. For the first time since entering the room, Cass hesitated. It was barely perceptible, but Vargas caught it, a moment where she seemed to be weighing exactly how much truth the situation could handle. Yes, sir, I have. Something about her response made Admiral Vargas decide that this particular hearing required more investigation than he had initially planned. Lieutenant Commander Zhao cleared her throat, drawing the room's attention back to the formal proceedings. Let's establish the timeline of events. Ensign Lee, please describe the specific circumstances that led to your complaint. Lee straightened in his chair, acutely aware of Admiral Vargas's presence, but trying to focus on presenting his case clearly. At approximately 11:30 hours yesterday, I was overseeing the relocation of sensitive communications equipment as part of our pre-deployment preparation. The equipment needed to be moved from temporary storage to its permanent installation site before we could complete system testing.
And Miss Morgan was part of your work detail? She was assigned to clean the storage area after the equipment was moved. When I directed the team to relocate the equipment to compartment C7, she interrupted the operation to question my orders. Admiral Vargas remained near the back wall, but his attention was completely focused on the proceedings. Something about the dynamic between the young ensign and the civilian contractor struck him as unusual. Most contractor disputes involved scheduling conflicts or payment issues, not safety regulation citations. Miss Morgan, Zhao said, turning toward Cass, please describe your understanding of what occurred. Cass's response was measured, precise. Ensign Lee ordered communications equipment to be moved to a compartment directly above the main fuel storage tanks. The proximity violates established safety protocols designed to prevent equipment damage and reduce fire hazards in the event of fuel vapor ignition. You felt qualified to make that assessment. I felt obligated to point out a safety violation when I observed one. Ensign Lee's face flushed. She wasn't making a safety assessment, Commander. She was questioning my authority in front of enlisted personnel. When I explained that operational necessity required immediate equipment placement, she refused to comply with a direct order. Is that accurate, Miss Morgan? Zhao's voice remained professionally neutral. I declined to participate in an activity that violated safety regulations. I offered to assist with equipment placement in any location that met regulatory requirements. Admiral Vargas found himself studying the way she phrased her responses. Most civilians facing disciplinary action tended toward either defensive explanations or apologetic compliance. Morgan spoke with the kind of measured precision that suggested experience with formal proceedings and a deep understanding of how words could be used as both shields and weapons. Miss Morgan, he said quietly, causing everyone in the room to turn toward him. How long did you serve in the Navy? The question seemed to catch her off guard, though her expression barely changed. 25 years, sir. What was your rating? Another pause, longer this time. Cass seemed to be calculating exactly how much information was necessary to answer the question truthfully without revealing more than the situation required. I served in various capacities, sir. It wasn't really an answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Admiral Vargas stepped closer to the table, his dark eyes fixed on Cass with growing intensity. Various capacities, he repeated. That's an interesting way to describe a naval career. Most sailors are proud of their rating. Chief Knox, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned forward slightly. Something about the Admiral's line of questioning was making her uncomfortable, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Sir, she interjected, Miss Morgan's previous service record isn't really relevant to the current complaint. Isn't it? Vargas's voice carried the quiet authority that made it clear the question was rhetorical. We're discussing whether a civilian contractor has the knowledge and experience necessary to evaluate naval safety protocols. Her background seems quite relevant." He turned back to Cass, noting the way she held herself, spine straight but not rigid, hands folded in her lap with military precision, eyes alert but not defensive. It was a posture he'd seen in countless briefing rooms and command centers, usually from officers who'd learned to remain calm under intense scrutiny. "Where did you serve your final tour, Miss Morgan?" "Pacific Fleet Operations, sir." "Doing what?" The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. When Cass finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Strategic coordination." Lieutenant Commander Zhao, whose legal training had taught her to recognize when questioning was revealing more than intended, looked between the Admiral and the civilian contractor with growing curiosity. There was a subtext to their conversation that she wasn't quite grasping, but the tension in the room was becoming palpable. "Admiral," she said carefully, "perhaps we should focus on the specific incident." "The specific incident," Vargas said, never taking his eyes off Cass, "involves a civilian contractor who demonstrates detailed knowledge of technical regulations, uses precise military terminology, and carries herself like someone accustomed to command responsibility. I'd like to understand how someone with that background ended up mopping floors on a supply vessel." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Ensign Lee looked confused, Chief Knox appeared increasingly uncomfortable, and Master-at-Arms Ortiz shifted his position slightly as if preparing for something he couldn't quite define. Cass looked directly at Admiral Vargas, and for a moment her carefully maintained composure seemed to waver slightly. "Sometimes circumstances change, sir." "I'd like to call a 15-minute recess," Admiral Vargas announced, his tone making it clear that this wasn't a request. "Lieutenant Commander Zhao, I need to speak with you privately." As the room began to clear, Cass remained seated, her expression unreadable. Chief Knox hesitated near the door, clearly wanting to ask questions but uncertain whether she had the authority to do so. Ensign Lee gathered his papers with nervous efficiency, throwing glances at the Admiral that suggested he was beginning to realize that his simple disciplinary complaint had triggered something much larger than he had anticipated.
"Miss Morgan," Ortiz said quietly, "there's a break area down the hall if you'd like some coffee." "I'm fine here, thank you." Ortiz nodded and stepped outside, but positioned himself where he could see through the conference room window. Something about the Admiral's intense interest in a civilian contractor was setting off his professional instincts, and he'd learned, over 8 years of military police work, to pay attention when situations felt like they were about to shift in unexpected directions. In the smaller adjacent office, Admiral Vargas closed the door and turned to face Lieutenant Commander Zhao. "I need you to run a complete background check on Cassandra Morgan. Full service record, not just the employment verification that would have been done for her contractor status." Zhao's fingers moved across her laptop keyboard with practiced efficiency. "What am I looking for, sir?" "I'm not sure yet, but something about her doesn't add up." Vargas paced to the small window that looked out onto the base's main thoroughfare, where sailors moved between buildings with the purposeful energy of pre-deployment preparation. "She knows regulations too well, carries herself like an officer, and responded to questioning like someone who's been through formal proceedings before." The computer screen filled with data as Zhao accessed the Navy personnel database. At first, the search returned exactly what they expected. Morgan Cassandra L., civilian contractor. Previous service record summarized as 25 years, honorable discharge, Pacific Fleet Operations. "Standard record," Zhao reported. "Nothing unusual in the basic—" She stopped mid-sentence, her voice trailing off as additional data populated the screen. "What is it?" "Sir, I think you need to see this." Admiral Vargas moved to look over her shoulder at the laptop screen. What he saw made him sit down heavily in the nearest chair. The full service record showed a progression through the ranks that was remarkable by any standard. seaman recruit to Rear Admiral in 25 years, with citations for exceptional leadership, strategic innovation, and personnel development programs that had been implemented fleet-wide based on her recommendations. But it was the final entry that made his hands tremble slightly as he read. Rear Admiral Cassandra L. Morgan, Pacific Fleet Strategic Operations Command, relieved of duty under classified circumstances. Separation, voluntary retirement to avoid court-martial proceedings related to Operation Neptune's Garden. The blood drained from Vargas's face. Neptune's Garden. You know about that operation, sir? I was there 22 months ago. Humanitarian relief mission to Southeast Asia that went sideways when local political situation collapsed. We had to evacuate 3,000 civilians under hostile fire while maintaining operational security for classified supply routes. Zhao waited, recognizing that her superior was processing information that went far beyond a simple disciplinary hearing. Admiral Morgan was task force commander, Vargas continued, his voice distant with memory. She coordinated the evacuation while under direct fire, managed logistics for 15 ships, and somehow got everyone out alive when the mission parameters changed hourly. The operation was a complete success from an operational standpoint. But someone in Washington needed a scapegoat when the political fallout hit. The mission had been classified, so when Allied governments started asking questions about American naval assets in their territorial waters, the Pentagon needed someone to take responsibility for decisions that couldn't be publicly defended. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window again. I was told that Admiral Morgan had died in the evacuation. Her transport was reported as missing, presumed destroyed by hostile fire. According to this record, she accepted full responsibility for operational decisions that exceeded authorized parameters. Rather than contest the charges, she voluntarily retired to protect the classified nature of the mission and the personnel under her command. Admiral Vargas stared out at the base, watching sailors move between buildings in the late morning sun. She fell on her sword to protect her crew and preserve operational security. The Pentagon got their scapegoat, the mission stayed classified, and everyone involved got to keep their careers and their clearances. Except her. Except her. He turned back to Fei Zhao. Do you understand what this means? The woman sitting in that conference room isn't just a former naval officer. She's one of the most decorated admirals of her generation, and she's been working as a janitor for 8 months while we treated her like invisible labor. Lieutenant Commander Zhao looked at the service record again, noting the commendations, the strategic innovations, the personnel development programs that had been implemented fleet-wide based on her recommendations. Sir, what do we do now? Now, we go back in there, and I try to figure out how to apologize to someone who sacrificed everything to protect people like us. When Admiral Vargas and Lieutenant Commander Zhao returned to Conference Room C, they found the other participants exactly where they'd left them. Chief Knox sat rigidly in her chair, clearly uncomfortable with the extended delay. Ensign Lee shuffled through his paperwork with nervous energy, and Master-at-Arms Ortiz maintained his position near the door with professional alertness.
Cass had not moved. She sat with the same controlled posture, hands folded, expression calm. But Admiral Vargas, now viewing her through the lens of her true identity, could see details he'd missed before. The way she held her head with unconscious authority, the calculating intelligence in her eyes as she assessed everyone who entered the room, and the subtle signs of someone who'd learned to command respect without demanding it. Before we continue with this hearing, Admiral Vargas said, his voice carrying a gravity that made everyone straighten slightly, I need to address something that's come to my attention. He looked directly at Cass.
Admiral Morgan. The use of her rank caused an immediate and dramatic shift in the room's dynamics. Chief Knox's eyes widened. Ensign Lee dropped the papers he'd been holding. Master-at-Arms Ortiz moved closer to the table, his professional instincts sensing that something significant was happening. Cass's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, not toward defensiveness, but toward a kind of quiet acceptance that her carefully constructed anonymity was ending. "I go by Ms. Morgan now, sir?" "No, you're Rear Admiral Cassandra L. Morgan, former commander of Pacific Fleet Strategic Operations, task force leader for Operation Neptune's Garden, and one of the most decorated officers of your generation. And for the past 8 months, you've been cleaning ships while we treated you like you were invisible." The silence that followed was absolute. Chief Knox looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Ensign Lee's face went through several shades of pale as he realized he'd been filing insubordination complaints against a rear admiral. Even Lieutenant Commander Zhao, who'd helped discover the truth, seemed stunned by hearing it spoken aloud. "Admiral Vargas," Cass said quietly, "that part of my life is over. I'm a civilian contractor now, nothing more." "Like hell you are." His voice carried the kind of command authority that had been earned through 3 decades of naval service. "You're a rear admiral who took the fall for a successful mission because someone in Washington needed a scapegoat. You protected your crew, preserved operational security, and sacrificed your career to keep other people safe." He turned to address the room. "Everyone here needs to understand what they're looking at. This woman coordinated the evacuation of 3,000 civilians under hostile fire. She managed logistics for 15 ships while under direct attack. She made split-second decisions that saved lives while knowing that those same decisions would probably end her career." Chief Knox found her voice first. "Sir, I don't understand. If Admiral Morgan was..." She struggled with the appropriate terminology. "If she outranks all of us, what is she doing working maintenance contracts?" "Because," Cass said, speaking for the first time since her identity had been revealed, "when you accept responsibility for classified operations that can't be publicly defended, your options for future employment become limited. The Navy needed someone to blame for decisions that couldn't be explained. I volunteered." "You volunteered to destroy your own career?" Ensign Lee's voice cracked slightly. "I volunteered to protect the careers and lives of everyone under my command. The mission was successful. Everyone got home alive. That's what mattered." Admiral Vargas studied her face, noting the quiet dignity with which she spoke about sacrificing everything she'd worked for. "And then what? The Navy just forgot about you?" "The Navy did exactly what it needed to do. The mission stayed classified, the personnel involved kept their clearances and their careers, and the political situation was managed. My part was to disappear quietly and let everyone move on." "So you ended up here, mopping floors on supply vessels." For the first time since her identity had been revealed, Cass's composure showed a crack. Her voice was barely audible when she replied, "It's honest work, and it's quiet." Master-at-Arms Ortiz, who had been listening with growing amazement, stepped forward. "Admiral, with respect, this is insane. You're one of the most qualified officers in the fleet, and you're cleaning bathrooms while ensigns file complaints against you for knowing too much about safety regulations." "Former officers, and the safety regulations matter regardless of who's citing them." Lieutenant Commander Zhao, who'd helped discover the truth, leaned forward. "Admiral Morgan, what you did during Neptune's Garden, taking responsibility to protect classified operations and personnel, that's exactly the kind of leadership the Navy claims to value. How did we get to a point where we're rewarding it with exile?" "Because," Admiral Vargas said, his voice heavy with understanding, "sometimes the system requires sacrifices that can't be publicly acknowledged. Admiral Morgan understood that when she made her choice." He looked directly at Cass. "But that doesn't make it right."
I want everyone except Admiral Morgan and Lieutenant Commander Zhao to step outside. This conversation needs to happen privately." Chief Knox opened her mouth as if to object, then seemed to think better of it. She stood and gestured for Ensign Lee to follow her. "Come on, Ensign. Let's go discuss how to properly apologize to a rear admiral."
Lee's face was still pale as he gathered his papers. "Chief, I had no idea." "None of us did. That's the point." Master-at-Arms Ortiz hesitated near the door. "Sir, should I remain for security purposes?" "That won't be necessary, Petty Officer, but thank you." When the door closed, leaving only the three of them in the small conference room, Admiral Vargas sat down across from Cass for the first time. The change in dynamics was immediate and profound. No longer a hearing about civilian contractor discipline, but a conversation between senior officers about institutional failure and personal sacrifice. "Cassie." His voice was softer now, using the nickname he'd known her by during their brief overlap years earlier. "When I heard about Neptune's Garden, when they told us you were missing, presumed dead, I wrote letters to your family. I recommended you for posthumous commendations. I spoke at a memorial service that never happened because your death was classified." Cass's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. She looked down at her hands, weathered now from months of cleaning work, and her voice was barely audible. "I know. I heard about the memorial. I wanted to contact you, to let you know I was alive, but you couldn't, because dead heroes don't complicate political narratives. Because dead heroes don't require pension payments or medical benefits or explanations about why their service records are classified," she corrected, with a bitterness that spoke of months spent thinking about the practical implications of her sacrifice. Lieutenant Commander Zhao, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned forward. "Admiral Morgan, what happened after you accepted responsibility for the operation?" "What happens to most people who fall on their swords? Quiet retirement, sealed records, and a very clear understanding that discussing the classified details of Neptune's Garden would result in prosecution under the Espionage Act. So, you disappeared." "I found work that didn't require security clearances or detailed background checks. I moved to places where nobody asked questions about my past. And eventually, I ended up here, doing honest work for people who needed it done." Admiral Vargas stood up and began pacing again, his agitation clear. "This is wrong, Cassie. Everything about this situation is wrong. You're one of the most capable officers I've ever known, and you're wasting away in exile because someone needed a scapegoat." "I'm not wasting away. I'm working. I'm contributing. And most importantly, I'm not putting anyone else at risk." "At risk of what?" "At risk of association with someone whose career ended in disgrace. At risk of having their own advancement questioned because they supported a disgraced admiral. At risk of being tarred with the same brush that painted me as someone who exceeded authority and endangered operations." Lieutenant Commander Zhao, who had been quietly observing the exchange, studied Cass's profile, noting the way she spoke about her situation with clinical detachment, as if discussing someone else's career. "Admiral, do you regret the decision you made?" Cass was quiet for a long time before answering. "I regret that the situation required the decision. I regret that good people had to choose between following orders that would have gotten people killed and exceeding their authority to save lives. I regret that the political complexity of the region made it impossible to acknowledge the success of the mission. But do you regret making the sacrifice?" "No. Everyone under my command got home alive. Their careers were protected. The mission objectives were achieved. That's what success looks like, even when it comes at personal cost." Admiral Vargas stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "What if I told you that the political situation has changed,
that there are people in positions of authority who understand what really happened during Neptune's garden and who want to make things right. I'd tell you that I'm not interested in rehabilitation. I'm interested in making sure that other people don't face the same choices I did. What does that mean? Cass looked up at him with the first spark of real energy he'd seen since her identity had been revealed. It means that there are probably dozens of veterans working civilian jobs on this base alone, people who left the service for various reasons and who are now treated as invisible labor because nobody bothers to find out who they really are or what they're capable of. Lieutenant Commander Zhao's legal mind immediately grasped the implications. You're talking about systematic institutional blindness to veteran experience and capability. I'm talking about a system that discards people when they become politically inconvenient and then ignores their continued existence. How many former senior NCOs are working security jobs because their age and experience make them unemployable in their field? How many former officers are driving trucks or cleaning buildings because they can't get clearances for positions that match their qualifications? Admiral Vargas sat down again, his expression thoughtful. You want to fix the system instead of your own situation. I want to make sure that the next person who has to choose between following orders and doing the right thing doesn't end up mopping floors for 8 months before anyone notices they might have something valuable to contribute.
The room fell silent as the three officers considered the implications of what Cass was proposing. Finally, Lieutenant Commander Zhao spoke. Admiral Morgan, what would you need to make that kind of systemic change? Official support, resources, and most importantly, the understanding that real reform requires admitting that the current system has failed people who deserved better. Admiral Vargas looked at her with the expression of someone who just discovered that a solution to a long-standing problem had been hiding in plain sight. Cassie, what would you say to a consulting position? Veteran reintegration and utilization assessment, official capacity, appropriate compensation, and the authority to make real recommendations for policy changes. For the first time since the conversation had begun, Cass smiled, a small, cautious expression that suggested hope was a luxury she'd learned not to indulge. I'd say that sounds like a mission worth accepting. The base assembly hall hadn't seen this kind of attendance in months. Word had spread through the informal networks that connected every military installation, the kind of communication system that operated faster than official channels and with considerably more accuracy. By 1400 hours, nearly 800 personnel had gathered in the concrete amphitheater that usually hosted safety briefings and mandatory training sessions. Admiral Vargas stood at the podium, his dress blue uniform bearing the ribbons and insignia of 30 years of distinguished service. But it was the woman seated in the front row who drew most of the attention, no longer wearing coveralls and carrying cleaning supplies, but dressed in civilian professional attire that couldn't quite hide the military bearing that had given her away. The murmur of conversation that had filled the hall gradually died as Admiral Vargas stepped to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm here today to discuss something that should concern every person who wears the uniform of the United States Navy. It's about how we see each other, how we value experience, and how we sometimes fail to recognize the extraordinary people who serve alongside us every day. His voice carried to the back of the hall without amplification, the product of years spent addressing crews and command staffs in conditions that ranged from perfect silence to combat chaos. 3 days ago, a disciplinary hearing was convened to address a complaint against a civilian contractor who had refused to follow orders she believed violated safety regulations. The hearing was routine, the kind of administrative procedure that happens dozens of times each month across the fleet. What made this hearing different was not the complaint itself, but what we discovered about the person who filed it. Admiral Vargas paused, letting his eyes move across the assembled crowd. He could see faces he recognized: Chief Knox, sitting with rigid attention; Ensign Lee, whose normally perfect posture seemed somehow diminished; Master-at-Arms Ortiz, who watched the proceedings with the intense focus of someone trying to understand how a simple disciplinary action had escalated into a base-wide assembly. The contractor in question is Miss Cassandra Morgan, who has worked maintenance duties aboard various vessels for the past 8 months. During that time, she has been professional, competent, and largely invisible, exactly the kind of reliable civilian support that keeps our operations running smoothly. Another pause, longer this time. When he continued, his voice carried a weight that made every person in the hall lean forward slightly. What we didn't know, what we failed to discover despite 8 months of daily interaction, is that Miss Morgan is retired Rear Admiral Cassandra L. Morgan, former commander of Pacific Fleet Strategic Operations and one of the most decorated officers of her generation. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the building's ventilation system seemed to make noise as 800 military personnel processed the implications of what they'd just heard. Admiral Morgan's final mission was Operation Neptune's Garden, a classified humanitarian evacuation that successfully rescued 3,000 civilians from a hostile combat zone. The operation was tactically brilliant, strategically necessary, and politically complicated. When the mission required decisions that exceeded authorized parameters, Admiral Morgan made those decisions knowing they would end her career. Admiral Vargas looked at Cass, who sat with the same controlled composure she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. She chose to accept full responsibility for mission decisions that saved lives but couldn't be publicly defended. She sacrificed her career, her reputation, and her place in the Navy to protect the people under her command and preserve the classified nature of operations that are still sensitive today. For the past 8 months, Admiral Morgan has worked quietly and competently in roles that utilized approximately 1% of her knowledge, experience, and capability. She has been treated as invisible labor by people who should have recognized her value, and she has accepted that treatment without complaint because she understood the cost of the choice she made. He stepped away from the podium, moving closer to the assembled crowd. I want everyone here to understand what this means. We had one of the Navy's most capable strategic thinkers mopping our floors while we complained about lack of experienced leadership. We had someone who had successfully managed complex multi-ship operations cleaning our equipment while we struggled with basic logistics coordination. Ensign Lee, who had been sitting in mortified silence since the Admiral began speaking, stood up suddenly. His voice carried clearly through the hall's acoustics. "Sir, request permission to address Admiral Morgan." Admiral Vargas nodded. "Granted."
Lee turned to face Cass, his young face showing the kind of genuine remorse that couldn't be manufactured. "Admiral Morgan, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond the specific complaint I filed. I was wrong about the safety regulations, wrong about your qualifications to assess them, and wrong about treating your concerns as insubordination. But more than that, I was wrong about not recognizing the experience and expertise of someone who was trying to help me avoid a serious mistake. I've learned more about leadership from this situation than I learned in 4 years at the academy. Thank you for that lesson, even though I didn't deserve the patience you showed in teaching it." The applause that followed was subdued but genuine, the kind of recognition that military personnel reserved for moments when someone demonstrated real growth under pressure. Chief Knox rose next, her expression showing the kind of humility that came from recognizing a profound failure of judgment. "Admiral Morgan, I've spent my entire career believing that rank and experience were easy to recognize, that real leadership was obvious to anyone who bothered to look. You've shown me how wrong I was about that assumption." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "More importantly,
You've shown me that dignity and competence don't require recognition to be real. I apologize for failing to see those qualities in you, and I promise to do better in recognizing them in others." Admiral Vargas returned to the podium as the applause faded. "Admiral Morgan has agreed to speak briefly about her experience and what we can learn from it." Cass stood slowly, moving to the microphone with the kind of measured pace that suggested she was still adjusting to being visible again after months of deliberate invisibility. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong, carrying easily through the hall. 8 months ago, I chose anonymity because I believed it was the best way to serve without complications. What I've learned during that time is that anonymity can become its own kind of prison, and that hiding from responsibility doesn't eliminate it. It just transfers it to other people. She looked out at the assembled crowd, noting faces she recognized from her months of quiet work. "The safety regulations I cited during the incident that brought us here exist because people have died learning why they're necessary. Those regulations don't care about rank or status or who's citing them. They care about keeping people alive. But more than that, this situation has shown me how many qualified, experienced people are working in positions that don't utilize their full capabilities because systems and assumptions prevent us from seeing who they really are. How many veterans are driving trucks when they could be training logistics specialists? How many retired NCOs are working security when they could be mentoring junior leaders? How many people with decades of specialized experience are invisible because we don't bother to look beyond their current job titles?" The hall was absolutely silent as she spoke, 800 people listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for emergency briefings. "I'm accepting a position as a consultant on veteran reintegration and utilization assessment. My mission will be to identify and address the systemic issues that prevent us from recognizing and utilizing the experience that surrounds us every day. But that mission will only succeed if all of you commit to looking beyond assumptions, asking better questions, and recognizing that real capability often comes disguised as ordinary competence." She stepped back from the microphone, then returned for one final comment. "And remember that safety regulations exist for good reasons. Follow them even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, the kind of recognition that came from understanding that they'd witnessed something significant, not just the revelation of a hidden identity, but a lesson about institutional blindness and the cost of failing to see the people who serve alongside us. The changes began subtly, in the way they always did aboard ships where word traveled faster than official communication. Within days of the assembly, sailors who had never spoken to Cass beyond basic courtesy were greeting her with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. But more significantly, they were applying the same attention to other civilian contractors and support personnel, asking questions about background and experience that revealed capabilities they'd never known existed. Petty Officer 2nd Class Malik Thompson found Cass in the forward maintenance compartment 3 days after the assembly, working with the same methodical competence that she'd always shown, but now surrounded by an atmosphere of respect that changed the entire dynamic of the space. "Admiral," he said, then caught himself. "I mean, Miss Morgan. Sorry, I'm still getting used to—" "Miss Morgan is fine, Malik. The rank belongs to a different part of my life." He nodded, but his posture remained more formal than their previous interactions. "I wanted to thank you for everything you taught me over the past 8 months, but also for what you've taught me over the past few days."
What's that? That leadership isn't about position or recognition. It's about doing the right thing, even when nobody notices, and especially when the cost is high. He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I've been thinking about re-enlisting, not just for another tour, but for a career. I want to be the kind of leader who recognizes people like you before they spend 8 months being invisible." Cass looked up from her work, studying his face. "The Navy needs leaders who understand that, Valik. But remember that real leadership starts with competence. Master your job, understand your people, and never stop learning." "Yes, ma'am. Yes, Ms. Morgan." As he walked away, Cass reflected on the conversation. Malik had always been a natural leader, but the revelation of her identity had given him a framework for understanding what leadership could look like when it was divorced from rank and recognition. That kind of understanding, multiplied across the hundreds of people who'd attended the assembly, represented the beginning of real cultural change. The ripples spread beyond the base through unofficial channels that connected military installations worldwide. Master-at-Arms Ortiz had mentioned the story to a friend stationed in Norfolk, who shared it with personnel at other East Coast facilities. Within 2 weeks, discussion threads on veteran forums were analyzing the implications of a rear admiral working unrecognized as civilian maintenance crew. The discussions weren't just about Cass's specific situation, but about the broader question of how military institutions utilized veteran experience and whether the transition from active duty to civilian life was creating artificial barriers that prevented optimal use of available expertise. Admiral Vargas, who had been monitoring these discussions as part of his informal assessment of the situation's impact, found himself impressed by the sophistication of the analysis being conducted by active duty and veteran personnel worldwide. The story had touched something deeper than individual sympathy. It had sparked genuine examination of systemic issues that affected far more people than one misidentified rear admiral. "Ms. Morgan," he said, finding her in the ship's engineering spaces where she was conducting one of her final maintenance shifts. "I have something you should see." He handed her a tablet displaying a secure message from the Chief of Naval Operations. The subject line read, "Veteran Utilization Assessment Initiative, Funding Approved. Your consulting position just became a full program, dedicated staff, multi-year funding, and authority to make binding recommendations for policy changes. They want you to start with Pacific Fleet installations and expand from there." Cass read through the message carefully, noting the scope of authority and resources being offered. It was more than she'd hoped for when she'd first suggested addressing systemic issues. "There's more," Admiral Vargas continued. "They want you to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee about veteran transition and utilization issues. Your story has caught the attention of people who can make real changes." For the first time since her identity had been revealed, Cass looked genuinely surprised. "They want me to go public with this? They want you to use your experience to fix a system that's been failing people for decades. The classification issues surrounding Neptune's Garden have been resolved. Enough details can be discussed to provide context for your sacrifice without compromising ongoing operations." Cass set down her cleaning supplies and looked around the engineering space that had become familiar over 8 months of quiet work. "I never intended for this to become a public story. The best stories usually don't start with that intention, but sometimes personal situations reveal universal truths that need to be addressed." She nodded slowly, understanding that her carefully maintained anonymity was ending permanently, but that the visibility might serve a purpose larger than personal comfort. "When do I start?" The pier stretched into Monterey Bay like a concrete finger pointing toward horizons that had called to sailors for generations. At 0530 hours, with the sun just beginning to burn off the coastal fog, Cass Morgan stood at its end and watched the USS Beacon prepare for deployment. The supply vessel that had been her workplace for 8 months was loading final stores and conducting last-minute systems checks before joining a task force bound for the Western Pacific. She wore civilian professional attire, navy blue blazer, pressed slacks, and shoes that would take her into congressional hearing rooms and Pentagon briefing spaces rather than ship compartments and maintenance areas. In her hand, she held orders that would transport her to Washington, D.C., where she would begin the work of transforming individual experience into systemic reform. "Thought I might find you here." Admiral Vargas's voice carried easily over the sound of waves against the pier. He approached with the measured pace of someone who understood the significance of final moments in familiar places. "Hard to believe it's only been 10 days since the disciplinary hearing," Cass said without turning around. "Feels like a different lifetime." "In many ways it is." He joined her at the pier's edge, both of them watching the controlled chaos of pre-deployment preparation. Any regrets about leaving anonymity behind? Some. Anonymity is comfortable, it's safe. You can't disappoint people who don't expect anything from you. But
you also can't help people who don't know you exist. She turned to face him, her expression showing the kind of resolve that had carried her through 25 years of naval service and 8 months of exile. The program you've described, the congressional testimony, the policy recommendations, they're all ways of making sure that other people don't face the choices I had to make. Admiral Vargas nodded, understanding the weight of what she was accepting. The Navy won't forget you again, Cassie. I can promise you that. I'm not doing this for recognition, Henry. I'm doing it because the system needs to change, and apparently I'm in a position to help change it. They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching sailors move across the Beacon's deck with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had learned to work together. Eventually, Malik Thompson appeared on the ship's bridge wing, scanning the pier until he spotted them. He raised his hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part salute, and entirely respectful. Cass waved back, then turned to walk toward the base transportation that would begin her journey to Washington. "Take care of him," she said to Admiral Vargas. "He's going to be a fine leader." "I will. And Cassie, the system you're about to change, it's been broken for a long time. Don't expect the fixes to be easy or quick. The best missions never are." As they walked back along the pier, Cass took one final look at the USS Beacon. The ship that had been her refuge for 8 months was now preparing to serve others, carrying supplies and support to sailors who would never know that their success depended partly on the quiet competence of people like her, people who did essential work without recognition because the mission required it. At the base gate, a Navy sedan waited to transport her to the airport. Admiral Vargas shook her hand with the formal courtesy that marked official farewells, but his words were personal. "Neptune's Garden was a success because you were willing to make hard decisions under impossible circumstances. This new mission will succeed for the same reason." "I'm not doing this for recognition, Henry. I'm doing it because the system needs to change, and apparently I'm in a position to help change it." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching sailors move across the Beacon's deck with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had learned to work together. Eventually, Malik Thompson appeared on the ship's bridge wing, scanning the pier until he spotted them. He raised his hand in a gesture that was part greeting, part salute, and entirely respectful. Cass waved back, then turned to walk toward the base transportation that would begin her journey to Washington. "Take care of him," she said to Admiral Vargas. "He's going to be a fine leader." "I will. And Cassie, the system you're about to change, it's been broken for a long time. Don't expect the fixes to be easy or quick. The best missions never are." As they walked back along the pier, Cass took one final look at the USS Beacon. The ship that had been her refuge for 8 months was now preparing to serve others, carrying supplies and support to sailors who would never know that their success depended partly on the quiet competence of people like her, people who did essential work without recognition because the mission required it. At the base gate, a Navy sedan waited to transport her to the airport. Admiral Vargas shook her hand with the formal courtesy that marked official farewells, but his words were personal. "Neptune's Garden was a success because you were willing to make hard decisions under impossible circumstances. This new mission will succeed for the same reason." "Thank you, Henry, for recognizing me when I didn't want to be recognized, and for supporting me when I needed support." As the sedan pulled away from the base, Cass watched the Pacific Fleet installations fade in the rear window. She was leaving behind 8 months of anonymity, but taking with her 8 months of understanding about how institutions could fail people, and how people could serve institutions, even when those institutions failed them. Her phone buzzed with the text message from Malik. "We'll look after the crew. Proud to have served with you even when I didn't know I was serving with you." She smiled, recognizing that the young petty officer understood something essential about service, that it wasn't about recognition or rank, but about competence, integrity, and commitment to something larger than personal comfort. The sedan merged onto Highway 1, carrying her away from the coast and toward an uncertain future. But uncertainty had never deterred her before. During Neptune's Garden, she'd made decisions without knowing their consequences, guided only by the principle that leaders do what the mission requires, regardless of personal cost. This new mission, reforming systems that discarded valuable people, creating pathways for veteran expertise to be recognized and utilized, ensuring that future leaders understood the difference between rank and leadership, would require the same kind of commitment. As the California coastline disappeared behind her, Rear Admiral Cassandra Morgan allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. For 8 months, she had been invisible, serving in the shadows of a system that had forgotten her value. Now she was returning to visibility, not to reclaim her lost status, but to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same institutional blindness. The mission was just beginning. But then again, the best missions always were. Outside the sedan's windows, the morning sun climbed higher, burning away the coastal fog and revealing the clear horizon that stretched endlessly toward possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. Behind her lay 8 months of hidden service and quiet competence. Ahead lay the challenge of transforming personal experience into institutional change, of turning individual sacrifice into systematic reform. It was, she reflected, as familiar landscapes gave way to unfamiliar territory, exactly the kind of mission worth accepting.
Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.